everybody, and welcome to the next semester of the collaboration between the New Bedford Whaling Museum and the second half. This is very exciting because we've really formed a partnership here, and each semester Sarah comes up with some wonderful things for us, and we're just excited about this. Today we're going to hear from Peggi Medeiros. She's a local historian and author. Anything you need to know about New Bedford, Peggi knows. So, any questions that you'll have, feel free to ask. But meantime, she has a wonderful lecture for us on influential women in New Bedford.
Oh, okay. I've got one. Actually, I'm here this afternoon to tell stories. And stories are actually history. A story is true, a story is untrue. As time extends, it matters less and less. The story we want to believe, those are the ones that survive, despite upheaval and transition and progress. Those are the stories that shape history. And that is a statement by a fictional, real human being, Captain Jack Rackham, who was hanged as a pirate in the West Indies. And it's appropriate because William Roache Sr., who started the story off, was actually a pirate of sorts himself. He built, well, actually his father, Joseph Roach, laid the foundation for all of this. But William then took it into a round-the-world, multinational corporation with his whaling ships. They began on Nantucket, had a very rough patch during the Revolution. Nantucket, as a matter of fact, attempted to stay neutral during the war and did not succeed. William Roache Sr. attempted to keep whaling during the war and actually sent a small fleet down to the Falklands Islands, which all got captured. In addition to being a sort of international pirate, he was a member of the Society of Friends, and that often got him and his family into a great deal of trouble. As a matter of fact, he was tried for treason during the Revolution, and the first reason he was tried by the state of Massachusetts because he had had a load of bayonets that somehow turned up on Nantucket in his warehouse. And he put them in a boat, took them out to sea and sank them. And what was Massachusetts was not, the Massachusetts, as he used to call it, was not happy with him. Nantucket wasn't very happy with him either. And after the Revolution, he faced a major problem. While we were still part of Great Britain, he could sell whale oil and spermaceti and ambergris at no duty in English ports. And once the United States became independent, that ended. So he decided to go traveling. First he thought about starting a whaling station in England. And in addition to being a pirate, William Sr. had a really dreadful temper. And he was turned down by the Prime Minister, William Pitt, and instead of staying to negotiate, he stalked off and went to France. And he established a whaling station at Dunkirk, met Thomas Jefferson, who did not like him at all, and brought over his family. And among the family that came to Dunkirk was his daughter, Mary. She was born in 1777, and by the time she got to Dunkirk, she was about 20. He also brought over to help run the whale ships and do all the business on shore, his son Benjamin. And And Benjamin was married to Eliza Barker. He had made a promise on Nantucket to her family that although he was taking her away to France, of course he would bring her back and they would see her again. Well, it turned out that Eliza Barker Roach became dreadfully seasick. So seasick that she would never voluntarily get on a ship again, and her family never saw her again. They were not happy. They told all of Nantucket they were not happy. I found a letter of William Roach Sr.'s where he complains about Eliza's family and how they're saying terrible things about him. But in Dunkirk, our second Roach heroine was born. Eliza was born in 1791 in Dunkirk. The very first thing she remembered was the guillotine being set up in the town square. And she loved it and was excited and pulled her nursemaid home to tell her mama, and her mother was not pleased, as you can imagine. In the meantime, back on Nantucket, William Roach Sr.'s son, William Roach Jr., and his brother-in-law, Samuel Rodman Sr., were running the American side of the business. That becomes important a little bit later. As everyone knows, the French Revolution went from bad to horrific. William Roach Sr. actually had a meeting with Robespierre and was lucky enough to make it out alive. Benjamin apparently worked with Lafayette and with Thomas Jefferson on what became Jefferson's treaties on whale oil. As things got worse and worse, William Sr. left, and he went to London to kind of prepare a beachhead for the family. About 8 months later, Benjamin was able to get the family away safely. And the story goes that there are a number of Englishmen who were trapped in France who convinced Benjamin to bring them back to England. And just as they were about to leave the harbor, the French National Guard turned up to search the ship. And if the men had been found, it would not have gone well. But Benjamin, who was a much looser Quaker than his father, had wine on board. He served the National Guard wine. We're not sure how much, but a lot. And they forgot to search the ship. The family's story was that Benjamin was supposed to settle a lawsuit in England and then come back to Nantucket. Well, the lawsuit dragged on, and Benjamin never came back. Instead, he established a whaling station at Milford Haven in Wales. And Milford Haven is where his daughter Eliza grew up. And Eliza is our second Roach heroine. She lived the life of an upper-class princess. Benjamin loved spending money, and he built, and he built, and he spent, and he spent. He turned their estate, Castle Hill, into a true paradise. He added wings to the stone-built castle. He hired a Scottish gardener who laid out a conservatory, and the conservatory, the Scotch gardener's name was Prendergast. The major conservatory was 80 feet long and 20 feet high. And as Eliza remembered it, it became the wonder of all the country round. And when filled with orange, lemons, citrus trees, made Castle Hill quite a showplace. Eliza's mother was disconcerted by this lifestyle. in a number of ways. She remained a firm member of the Society of Friends, and she saw that Eliza did too, and attempted it with Eliza's brothers, which didn't work terribly well. Milford Haven happened to be where Admiral Nelson and Lady Hamilton were sailing in and out, and they were introduced, the Lord of Milford Haven and his family were introduced to Lord Nelson and Lady Hamilton, and Eliza Barker Roach was absolutely scandalized and refused to shake hands with that woman. She also was more than worried about Benjamin's building spree, and our Eliza remembered on the day that they were christening one of the new wings, and they invited everyone in the neighborhood to come. Eliza went looking for her mother, and she found her sobbing in her room saying, "When will this end?" And she wiped her tears and straightened up and went out with Eliza, and they welcomed the neighbors. Benjamin, unfortunately, was not the world's greatest businessman. And for a while, he did very, very well in the whaling trade. But there got to be a point, and it was just before Napoleon and war broke out, when he overextended his whaling. And unfortunately, at the time that the whale oil and spermaceti reached London, it was basically worth absolutely nothing. So Benjamin lost everything. Luckily, he had an older son, Benjamin, who eventually became a member of Parliament and bailed him out. But they had a number of children, and there was the question of what they were going to do with their children. And so Benjamin, and I think Benjamin made the decision on his own, to send Eliza to New Bedford. So Eliza arrived in New Bedford and lived with her grandfather, William Roache Sr., and her grandmother, and her Aunt Mary. And let's see if I can get this to work. This is a later house that Mary Roach built that had an amazing history. But the family of William Roache Sr. and they settled in what was known as the Mansion House. It was on Union Street here in New Bedford. It was a purpose-built mansion for them. And at the same time, William Roache Sr. had called the rest of his family out from Nantucket to New Bedford. So William Roache Jr. arrived here, and Samuel Rodman Sr., and the entire Roach business now became part of New Bedford permanently. So Mary and Eliza, who were both at that point firm members of the Society of Friends, of course became involved in local meeting. And as many of us know, in 1822, there was a religious explosion in the Society of Friends. There was a conflict between New Light and Old Light Quakers, and Mary and Eliza were both in the middle of it. And I discovered that a gentleman named Benjamin Waterhouse came to New Bedford and came to our Quaker meeting. He was a very interesting character who was a close friend of Thomas Jefferson's, and he'd studied medicine in Europe, and he brought back one of the first inoculations for smallpox that actually worked. It made him famous. He became the first medical professor at Harvard, and he became a good friend of Eliza's future husband. And on November 30th, 1823, Waterhouse wrote to Jefferson describing what was going on in New Bedford. He describes that the Unitarians were becoming a new sect. He notes the rich and growing town of New Bedford, built by the most opulent Quakers of Nantucket and Rhode Island, has caught a spark from Lynn, and they are exhibiting strong marks of reformation. And he goes on to describe the Roache family. Several of their members of both sexes are very well educated and have resided a considerable time in France and in England. And being rich, they have pretty extensive libraries and other means of general information. All of this class proclaims the one all-perfect God, and in no small number remain to a degree of amazement, fearing that they have hitherto believed a cunningly devised fable. A ranting, enthusiastic Calvinist might now drive these people to craziness. But then there was Eliza, a different kind of preacher having risen up among them. I was there within a few weeks, where I witnessed the unusual sight of a fine woman of perhaps 8 and 20 named Roach, born in France. And clearly she knocked Waterhouse right out. She boldly, but not arrogantly, a mixture of firmness and modesty, preaches to the people that religion consists not in a peculiar dress, but in conduct, and that everyone must work out his own salvation and not rely on the merits of another. This new doctrine, coming from under a leghorn hat and urged by a handsome person handsomely dressed, will be listened to with pleasure by the rising and just risen generation. The woman, of course, was our Eliza, and our local meeting actually reported her back to the Quaker Society of Friends in England as a heretic. At this time, members of the Roache and members of the Rodman family, with the exception of Samuel Rodman Jr., who was another case, and the Arnolds, all left the Society of Friends. The Roaches and the Arnolds ended up as Unitarians. The Rodmans ended up as Episcopalians in Grace Episcopal Church. And what is so fascinating about these two women, Eliza and Mary, who were far more interesting than the males in their family, are what they achieved. And let's see. Oh, there's our pirate. There's Milford Haven at the time they were there. And there's another view of Milford Haven. There's the mansion house, which unfortunately burned down. It would be wonderful if we still had it. And Margaret Fuller became a close friend of Mary Roach. Mary Roach was undoubtedly a mystic, and she had an enormous influence, first of all, on Ralph Waldo Emerson, who came to New Bedford briefly and took over the pulpit at the Unitarian Church. At that point, he was in a kind of religious depression. He and Mary Roach met and became very good friends, and they spent a lot of time talking about the inner light and what following it meant. Emerson remained a friend of Mary Roach's for the rest of her life. He often came to New Bedford, and later he visited James and Sarah Arnold in their federal mansion. We'll get to James and Sarah in a few minutes. but he also introduced Mary to Margaret Fuller. And what's fascinating about this story is that Eliza remained unmarried, living with her aunt and her grandfather and her grandmother until her grandfather and grandmother died. And then she was free. She had somehow been introduced to Professor John Farrar at Harvard, who was a mathematician, who was about 14 years older than she was. And they married. And the sort of Bible for original sources on the Roaches is The Roaches, which was written by John Morgan Bullard. And there are some wonderful letters in here from all of the members of the family. There is one that is an absolute gem from Eliza, which is written to a friend in Boston. And the normally calm Eliza is very nervous about the wedding, and she's very nervous about what she should wear, and she's worried about how soon she's going to have to see Harvard people, and can she possibly put them off for a couple of weeks until she's settled in. And she writes her friend, and at that time the recipient paid postage, and Eliza apologized and said, "I'm sorry to make you pay postage for such a poor scrap of a letter all about my own concerns. But I was called off for my writing and that I could add no more." She goes on, she received the corsets and her mind is pretty much gone. And if you mention the war with the Turks, she'll think about Russian toweling. So she was nervous, but on the other hand, she married in New Bedford. And her young niece, Sarah Arnold, stood up for her. A letter from another friend talked about how lonely Aunt Mary was going to be. But what I love is the description of Eliza in her wedding dress. She was dressed in an elegant white satin with a deep crepe silk flounce with satin rolls, top and bottom, full short sleeves with a deep lace border around the neck and lace scarf, no handkerchief. I like the open, respectable way in which she married and the manner in which she spoke of it. And another member of the community, one of the Grinnells, said, well, you know, Eliza talked enough about all of this for the whole town to be bored with it. And this writer said, no, I like it. It showed nothing hidden or that they were ashamed of. I see not why, as it was a pleasant thing all round, they should not speak of it. So they lived, Eliza and John Farrar lived in Cambridge. As I mentioned, he was older than she was. At that time, everyone at Harvard knew everyone else, and professors' wives were expected to entertain. And entertain Eliza Roach did. And in the course of her entertaining, she met a very young Margaret Fuller and took her under her wing. And there's a wonderful line that says, Eliza Roach taught Margaret Fuller how to enter a drawing room, and Mary Roach taught her to save her soul. And we know from letters and from a number of sources that Margaret Fuller visited here in New Bedford, and she visited at the first slide I showed you, which was the home that Mary had built for herself. And of course now everyone knows who Margaret Fuller is. She was our first great feminist writer and a teacher, and she held conversations in Boston. She became a reporter for Horace Greeley in New York, but she was not allowed to go into the office. She had to write from her apartment. She eventually went to Rome, lived through the siege of Rome, married an Italian count, had a son, decided to come home and drowned. with her baby and her husband off Fire Island. And as a matter of fact, everything is so completely interrelated in Massachusetts at this time that Emerson, who had loved Margaret Fuller, sent Henry David Thoreau off to the wreck site to try to find her body. And I believe he was able to find a case, but none of the bodies were ever found. But coming back to Mary Roach, in 1842, Margaret spent a week at Mary Roach's home on South 6th Street. And we have a number of letters from Margaret to Aunt Mary, or about Aunt Mary. My favorite is one that she wrote to Emerson. On June 23rd, 1842, she said, "Dear Waldo, I feel like writing to you, but cannot perceive that there is much of a letter lying in my mind. It does not agree with my humor just now to be going about and seeing so many people, and I don't thrive under it. It is not Aunt Mary's fault, though I do not exactly as I please. For she is a nonpareil of a hostess in a combination of quiet, courteous attention to the comfort of her guests, with the desire to be left alone whenever it is best. There's some discussion of friends and plans, and unfortunately none of the friends are from New Bedford. She ended the letter, your affectionate Margaret, but there was a postscript that said, P.S. I like Aunt Mary's dry humor. Have you ever seen that? And one lovely thing now is that Mary Roach turns up in biographies of Emerson and turns up in biographies of Margaret Fuller. Now back to Eliza in Cambridge. She eventually became a writer, and a really superb writer. She published a number of children's books, but the two books that she is best known for are The Young Lady's Friend. And The Young Lady's Friend is basically a how-to etiquette guide for young ladies. And if you're interested, you can find it on the internet. I find it quite delightful. There are a few chapters in here of it in the Roaches. And she does this wonderful beginning where she's writing to young ladies who are free from school and can do whatever they want and go anywhere they want and see anyone they want. And she sort of brings it up with a check, but you really can't. And explains how to survive in society. And her second book, which is enormously valuable, is her Recollections of 70 Years, and it's basically her autobiography. So we actually know a great deal more about Eliza than we can about Mary Roach. I would love to know what happened to Mary Roach's papers and more of her letters, but so far haven't had much luck with that. And that is the story of Mary and Eliza and France and Jefferson and England. And poor Eliza Barker Roach, who never got to come back to Nantucket again. That's Margaret, that's Emerson, of course. And let's see. Oh, that is Eliza's husband, John. I have not been able to find any, well, that's not that, it doesn't tell us very much. It's a small image. She does look a bit Quakerly. And maybe it's a family resemblance, but she actually reminds me of someone I was lucky enough to know, Sarah Delano, who was very involved in the museum. And I think Eliza Roach has the look of her. Oops, gotta go back a bit. That is the first edition of The Young Lady's Friend. And the next New Bedford person, lady, we're actually talking about two women who were quite extraordinary. One is Cornelia Grinnell Willis, and the other is Harriet Jacobs. Cornelia Grinnell was the daughter of Cornelius Grinnell Jr. Just about everyone knows the Grinnell Mansion up on County Street. Well, next to it, what is now the Kennedy Donovan Center, was the home of Joseph Grinnell's brother, Cornelius Grinnell Jr. And the Grinnell family has, I've been told by surviving members of the Grinnell family, a propensity to suicide. And just about in every generation, one male member of the family has committed suicide. And in that generation, it was Cornelia's father. She had been named for him. And upon her father's death, she was adopted formally by Joseph Grinnell, soon to be Congressman Joseph Grinnell, and his wife. And she was very young at the time. She was 4 or 5. And she was brought up by them in the Grinnell Mansion. And she was brought up as much like a princess as Eliza was at Milford Haven, her father's home. We know that Joseph Grinnell allowed the very first Christmas tree in New Bedford to be set up and for Christmas to be celebrated for Cornelia. And we know about it because Samuel Rodman Jr. wrote about it in his diaries and wrote about the fact that his children had gone to the party. And it's quite a wonderful picture. And if you ever have the chance, the first floor of the Grinnell Mansion is very much as it was. And there's sort of a double parlor, and you can get a sense of where that Christmas tree would have been set up. The Grinnells, when she was about 12, took Cornelia to Europe for a grand tour. And in Rome, they decided not to have her painted, but to have her sculpted. And she was sculpted by Thomas Crawford, who is a sculptor who has done the Victory on the tops, the Congressional Dome. He was considered one of the great sculptors of the day. And in one of the first floor rooms here, the Whaling Museum owns the sculpture of young Cornelia. And at that same time in Rome, she met a young man who was a bit older than she was. He was, Nathaniel Parker Willis, was considered America's Charles Dickens. That is Nathaniel Parker Willis as a young man. Yep, I'll sit down. Willis was the son of a Boston minister who did not want to become a minister. And instead he ended up going to New York City, where he became a journalist. And he soon became one of the great successes of New York. Nathaniel Parker Willis became the toast of the town. He became fairly wealthy. He married for the first time and had a couple of children. I'm convinced that Nathaniel Parker Willis is due for a revival. He was actually a very good writer. And one thing that may bring about a revival of Nathaniel Parker Willis is that An extraordinary American writer, George Saunders, has just written a book called Lincoln in the Bardo. It's a novel, and part of it are the conversations of ghosts with young Willie Lincoln after his death in the White House. But part of it are excerpts from news stories and news clippings, and a number of them are by Nathaniel Parker Willis, and they're descriptions of, he knew Willie Lincoln and described the little boy. So I'm hoping that will bring Nathaniel Parker Willis into some kind of favor again, especially because I have one of his books, Idlewild. Idlewild became Nathaniel Parker Willis's mansion on the Hudson, where he lived with Cornelia and their children. Because, of course, the wonderful thing is they met again in Washington, D.C., and they married. Before I get to Harriet Jacobs and what makes Harriet so special, I have to mention that Nathaniel Parker Willis was a close friend of Edgar Allan Poe's. And Poe actually wrote about Willis as one of the few American writers he appreciated. And if you've ever read any of Edgar Allan Poe's journalism, he was a really killing critic. I mean, he just demolished everyone, but he was fond of Willis. And he said it could have been the fate of this gentleman to be alternately condemned ad infinitum or lauded ad nauseum, a fact which speaks much in his praise. We know of no American writer who has evinced greater versatility of talent, that is to say of high talent, often announcing to genius. And after Poe's death, a great deal of extraordinarily nasty things were written about him, that he had been the fables and fictions about Poe just go on and on. Willis actually wrote a piece sort of refuting all of this and saying that Poe was a genius and he was an extraordinary man. And Willis knew he wasn't a genius, but he did the best he could as a writer, and he was a very good, middle-of-the-road, sort of a David McCullough writer. Before his wife died, he had met Harriet Jacobs. Harriet Jacobs was an escaped slave from Maryland, I believe, and she had spent years hiding in an attic because she was terrified of being sent out again, sent back south. Jacobs didn't particularly like Willis and thought he was kind of sneering. But she had loved Willis's first wife, Mary, who had taken her with the family to England. And she did love Cornelia and Cornelia's children. And Harriet and the Grinnell family and children would be tied together for their entire lives. And let's see if I can do this without ruining. Okay, that is Idlewild, which is the Willis family seat. Okay, why aren't we going forward? Okay, let's try this again. Okay, let's see. Is that Idlewild? There's Nathaniel as a very young man. That's the portrait that the engraving was taken from. And in the 19th century, if you had your portrait engraved, it meant that it was sold in print shops and people put you up on their walls. There's another view of him when he was extremely young. This is Harriet Jacobs, but Harriet was an older woman. And for a long time, it seemed that was the only existing photograph of Harriet. But when I was researching this, I found some photographs on a Harriet Jacobs website. Harriet Jacobs, according to this photograph, is seated. And this is supposed to be, this is labeled as Harriet as the time she worked for Cornelia. So that would have been one of the Grinnell babies. And this is a photograph that my friend Carol Foster discovered in the Whaling Museum collections. And we wonder if this is Harriet. And haven't had any luck tracing it yet, but we're going to keep going on it. Unfortunately, Southerners did not give up their slaves with any kind of, they never gave up. They sent people north to find them, and at a time when Cornelia and Nathaniel and Harriet and the Grinnell children and Harriet's children, she had several young children of her own, were living in New York, Harriet's former master appeared looking for her. Joseph Grinnell immediately sent Harriet and the children to New Bedford to hide in the Grinnell mansion. Cornelia decided that Harriet could not live like this, that it would be impossible. So she paid Harriet's owner for her freedom. She gave him $300. Joseph Grinnell said to her, "Do you know what you're doing? Do you know this is against the law and you could be jailed?" And she said, "I know, but this has to be done." Harriet had not wanted her to do it, but Cornelia went ahead and did. Years later, Harriet wrote an autobiography, the Autobiography of a Slave Girl. It was published with a pseudonym. It pretty much tells the story of her life. Harriet in Boston was taken up by a writer named Lydia Maria Child, who at the time was kind of like Harriet Beecher Stowe. And she pushed to have Harriet's book published, and Amy Post, the Amy Post, also became involved in getting the book published. It's considered the finest description ever written of what it was like to be an enslaved woman in the South. The story has a happy, sad ending. As I mentioned, Cornelia and Harriet were attached for the rest of their lives. Even though Harriet was not fond of Nathaniel Parker Willis, when he was dying, she came and nursed him because he had asked her, "When I'm at the end, will you come?" And she had said yes. She eventually ran a school, had a basically happy life, had children. Her children remained friends with the Grinnell children. It's a wonderful story of what a New Bedford woman who was brought up basically to be a decorative princess can manage to achieve. And if you haven't read Harriet's autobiography, I believe you can find it free on the internet. And there's at least one wonderful biography of her by Jean Yellen, and there is a book of Jacobs' family papers, which has more information than you could believe possible. Oh, this was Idlewild, a photograph of Idlewild. This is all I could find of Cornelia's. I looked everywhere to find a portrait and couldn't. I mean, I tried everything from the New York Historical Society to the Metropolitan Museum of Art to Boston to here, of course. Didn't have any luck. I did find this. It's a piece of lace that Cornelia donated to the MFA. I don't know if it's on display, but it's very beautiful. And the next New Bedford woman that I want to talk about is Sarah Arnold. Sarah Arnold's father was William Roache Jr. She was born on Nantucket, actually on June 3rd, 1786. And when her grandfather moved the family to New Bedford, of course she came and became a little New Bedford girl. She grew up in the house across the street, the Seaman's Bethel. And when Sarah was in her teens, her beloved aunt, Charity Rodman Roach, who was married to Thomas Roach, who was William Roach Jr.'s brother, moved out to Kendall, Ohio with him. Thomas Roach and Charity were probably the last remaining extremely religious members of the family as far as being part of the Society of Friends go. They went to and founded Kendall, Ohio, which is right next to the town of Massillon, Ohio. Excuse me. Their home was a stop on the Underground Railroad. And the Massillon Public Library has the greatest collection you can imagine outside the Whaling Museum. They have a collection of all the letters that were sent to Thomas and to Charity from their family and friends in New Bedford. And the women in the family especially together among them decided that every week one of them would write to Charity and would tell her about what was happening in New Bedford. The letters are wonderful. Anyone you can think of in New Bedford, Rodman Roach history, was writing to her. And we have some letters from Sarah before she was married to her future husband, Thomas Arnold. One of my favorite letters is sent early, and it begins, "Dear Aunt Charity." And Sarah begins telling Aunt Charity about the fact that she had heard that a woman in Dartmouth was very sick and needed help. So she went on her horse with a couple of her cousins and went to visit the woman. And they found her, and she was dying. She was just lying on a thin mattress on the floor, and her children, who were very young, were just crawling all over her. Apparently the woman's husband was, that classic phrase, no better than he could have been. And the woman begged Sarah to take her daughter, Betsy, who was 5, and to raise her. And Sarah writes to her Aunt Charity that she was about to say yes, and then she realized without her father's permission she didn't have the right to do it. And then there is a follow-up letter that she went home and told her father and said, "Can't something be done in New Bedford to take care of these miserable little creatures?" And William Roach Jr., basically, who was better at counting money than heart, said, well, that would cost $10,000 and it would have to be collected. And he thought it was impractical because, you know, Bedford was just a little village. But Sarah also wrote on charity, I hope at some future period the minds of a larger part of the community may be turned towards them, though at present it seems to occupy but a small part of their attention. And when Sarah grew up, she did give. She never forgot those children. She and her husband, James Arnold, gave a great deal of money to charity. There are stories about Sarah, you know, people just sort of creeping up to the kitchen door up on County Street in what is now the Wamsutta Club. The central portion of the club is the James Arnold Mansion. So that is where Sarah and James and their daughter Elizabeth lived. Sarah became this extraordinary combination of a woman who was a very devout Unitarian with someone who was part of society, and she was adored by society in general. Sarah was fairly frail. She seems to have had a form of arthritis or rheumatism, and James Arnold began taking her to spend the winters in Boston. And there she met everyone from the then mayor of Boston, Josiah Quincy, to, of course, everyone at Harvard because of Arnold's Eliza. And she met Richard Henry Dana Sr., who is now largely forgotten. But he was a Shakespearean scholar who never made it as a lawyer, but had enough Dana family money that it didn't matter. He absolutely adored Sarah. He wrote her a number of wonderful letters when he couldn't see her. There's a great one where he describes in detail meeting Dickens on his ship when Charles Dickens arrived in Boston on his first trip. Richard Henry Dana's son, Richard Henry Dana Jr., managed to riot and flunk his way out of Harvard. And there are letters to Sarah talking about what happened and how he was, the family was heartbroken. Well, Richard Henry Dana ended up going to sea. And when he came back, he wrote 2 years before the mast, which is still considered a classic. Herman Melville actually admitted it was a pretty good book. And he became a friend of Sarah Arnold's and would often visit her in New Bedford, and basically in his diary he said he thought she was the most beautiful woman he had ever met. James, let's see. So that is the house. If you look closely, that core is still there. This is James Arnold. This is not the James that you usually see, who's a fat elderly man at the Bedford Free Public Library. This is what James looks like when he was a young man. I think he looks like something out of Trollope. And this sketch was made of him when he was in Paris on a tour with Sarah and his wife Elizabeth. There were also sketches made of Elizabeth and Sarah, but I don't have those. This is the earliest that I've been able to find of Sarah Roache Arnold, and it is from the museum collection. And this is the Arnold family in Rome. This was made, they were painted by a quite famous Scottish painter whose name is escaping me at the moment, but the National Gallery of Edinburgh, Scotland, is full of his paintings. That painting, I am assuming, used to hang on the landing in the Arnold home. Unfortunately, it now belongs to Harvard. It belongs to the Arnold Arboretum, to be correct. And it was given to the Arboretum by the Arnold's nephew. Elizabeth Arnold never had any children, so that when James and Sarah and Elizabeth died, the line that's in the Arnold genealogy is the line is extinct. And the Arnold mansion, with gardens that were a horticultural wonder, and are described in books, and there are engravings, and the land ran almost as far as Rockdale Avenue, to give you an idea of how large the Arnold Gardens were. We believe the beech trees in front of what is now the Wamsutta Club were planted by James Arnold. We know that Daniel Ricketson, who was a great friend of Henry David Thoreau, actually, on a request from Thoreau, went to the Arnold grounds and got permission from the gardener to collect leaves, and he sent the leaves to Thoreau. And I believe that the leaves are in the Harvard University collections. I am entirely fascinated by Sarah Arnold. I've been researching her and writing about her for years. I should mention that after the death of her father, William Roache Jr., in 1850, she gave what had been his mansion, which was actually right on this spot here where we are all sitting, to the New Bedford Port Society, and it was moved up the hill, and it became the Mariners' Home, which is just about to reopen. And Sarah also left the Port Society $6,000 in her will. The way it worked out, Elizabeth died first, and then, no, I'm wrong. Sarah died in May 1860. Her daughter Elizabeth died in October 1860, and James Arnold lived on alone in the mansion until 1868. And then it was inherited by his nephew, William J. Roach, who was the second mayor of New Bedford, who had a vast number of children, all of whom moved out of New Bedford and went to Boston. And the portrait eventually went with them. It seems to have just decided to stop on us. Okay. And this is one member of a family who remained in the Society of Friends. Rachel Smith Howland was a trophy bride. She was born in New Jersey to, obviously, the Smith family, which was considered one of New Jersey and Pennsylvania's first families. Her father had died when she was very young, and the family didn't have a great deal of money. They ended up living on a family farm, and she became engaged to a young man who died, and then basically her mother sold her to the New Bedford Howlands, to be quite frank about it. She was a trophy bride, and this is the family of good Howlands. This is not the Hetty Green branch of the family. This is another kind of family. Rachel's daughter-in-law, a marvelous woman named Caroline T. Howland, wrote an autobiography, and she talked about how Rachel ended up marrying into New Bedford. Rachel had been engaged to someone she loved desperately. He died. She was expected to prop up the fortune. Her mother was anxious for her to make a suitable marriage, and Matthew Howland of New Bedford, Mass. Was accepted as a promising suitor, and later they were married. And I, as Rachel's daughter-in-law, have always felt that her heart was not fully satisfied. We can trace Rachel in New Bedford from when she arrived as a bride, and Samuel Rodman Jr. saw her at the meeting house. And he knew immediately that she was not someone who would be a shrinking violet in any way. Rachel always said exactly what she thought. She used to argue with her brother-in-law, George Howland, and other members of the family. Her husband, Matthew, was very supportive of her. And since there was a lot of Howland family money at that point, she was able to support things that mattered. One of the earliest things she did was that she was a trustee of a free black school for children in Washington, D.C. that was run by a woman named Myrtilla Minor. And she was on the board with Harriet Beecher Stowe and her brother, Henry Ward Beecher, who became famous as a preacher in Brooklyn, New York, who was a rabid abolitionist. And in fact, Henry Ward Beecher, who spoke in New Bedford on a number of occasions, at Liberty Hall, at one point outraged everyone by auctioning off what he said was a young slave girl to let his parishioners and congregation have an idea of what a slave auction was like. Frederick Douglass thought the idea of a school for free black children was horribly dangerous, and that, you know, everyone concerned, including Rachel, were absolutely out of their minds. At one point in 1860, someone set the school on fire. The children did escape, and Myrtilla Minor also escaped. Rachel also became a great friend of Harriet Beecher Stowe, and there are stories that Harriet Beecher Stowe visited Rachel at her summer home, which is called Hazelwood, which we now know as Hazelwood Park, which is built by the Comden family, and it is my hope that someone will get their act together and restore two of the earliest, most glorious Gothic cottages in America. The homes at Hazelwood predate the Roach Cottage at 19 Irving Street, which is a National Historic Landmark. Rachel was absolutely fearless, and Matthew was very proud of her. And she actually, in 1865, went to Washington, D.C., and went to the White House and prayed with President Lincoln. And it made a kind of wonderful sense, because Lincoln, of course, suffered from horrific depression, and there are more than a few hints that Matthew Howland also did. So Rachel knew about comforting men in emotional pain. What about Matthew, you know, who was sort of given a reluctant bride? He was 28 when they married. He may have had epilepsy. Rachel was 2 years older. Matthew became the private, responsible Howland whaling firm man. George could be mayor of New Bedford and donate his salary to the public library. Matthew instead walked every day to the counting house and balanced the books and kept the family going. And Everett Allen in Children of the Light writes about Matthew Howland. Matthew Howland and the Howland firm is sort of what he uses as a template to tell the story of whaling in New Bedford and in the Arctic. And it's quite wonderful. The greatest thing that Rachel probably ever did, well, she did two grand things. One is that she tried to break the very first Wamsutta strike. And she sided with the workers, and she tried to convince her brother-in-law, George, who was the mayor, that ownership should negotiate with the workers. She was chosen as a negotiator. George, in the meantime, was threatening to call out the militia with rifles. And Rachel said, George, you couldn't possibly consider firing. And he said, oh, just watch me. But the grandest thing Rachel did was to organize the Association for the Relief of Aged Women of New Bedford. And it is still in existence today, and it is still assisting women. Rachel was also involved, Rachel was involved in everything you can imagine in New Bedford. She was very passionate about education. And at one point, I found a long description of a meeting she held at her winter home, which was on Hawthorne Street, with the principals of the New Bedford High School, and all of the teachers. Principal was new, and the effort was to kind of bring the teachers and the principal together to think a little bit more about the young people they were leading. Rachel, unfortunately, had a very sad widowhood. Matthew died, and the first thing that happened was that they lost their home on Hawthorne Street, which had been built for them in 1840. And this was 1882, and Rachel wrote to one of her sons, Morris, who was in New York, and she said, William Crapo is still trying to get this place, but says he will not give over $30,000 while Father asks $40,000. What shall we do? I think Father is very poorly indeed and very low-spirited. What shall we do with him or for him? Thou must come and see him. And then she says, Crapo has not treated us handsomely. He seems to think that he could just gobble us up and turn us out of house and home for his pleasure. And so the big fish eat up the little ones. And I am not going to go on with the sad story of the family, what happened to the family. Rachel had a son, Matthew D. Howland, who is famous for building a model village for textile workers in the south end of New Bedford. Rachel eventually moved to Providence, Rhode Island to live with another of her sons, who actually was the editor of the Providence Journal. And I have a couple of photos that I'd like to show you. Yes, please. Okay. This is Rachel and her children. And that is a young Rachel. And this is Llewellyn Howland, Priscilla Howland, Rachel Smith Howland, and the youngest, Carolyn Child Howland. And now I'm going to talk very quickly before we do questions and answers about one of my favorite New Bedford women who most people have never heard of. This is Eliza Bierstadt. Eliza Bierstadt was probably the first woman in America to sell paintings and to do it very, very well. She was the youngest of all of the Bierstadt children, and she was the only one of the children to be born in America. She was born on August 3rd, 1833. Her family had arrived in New Bedford from Prussia the year before, and she had 3 surviving important brothers, and the one we know best is, of course, Albert Bierstadt, the great painter. But his brothers, Charles and Edward, became pioneer photographers. First in New Bedford, then in Washington, then in New York, and then in Buffalo. And there was one sister, Helen. So Eliza grew up in a family of artists, and she began, we know, selling paintings at the Ehlers Gallery nearby on William Street. And one of the painters who she dealt in was Charles Henry Gifford, who is a wonderful painter from Fairhaven. He was an absolute genius. He's known for what are called his little gems, which are small, luminous paintings. She sold over $10,000 in 2006 figures of Gifford's paintings. They'd become friends at the Ellis Gallery. Eliza was responsible for the only book that Gifford ever published, which is impossible to find, called Seaside Sketches. She helped him find studio space in New York. And we know that she also sold Albert's paintings and those of other artists. Oh, thanks. There's Albert. That's Eliza's gravestone in Little Cemetery with all the rest of the Bierstadt family. And that's a larger view of the Bierstadt family plot. And that is one of Albert's earliest, truly magnificent paintings. It was his first masterpiece, Sunlight and Shadow, which was painted while he was studying in Italy. Albert took her with him to Europe and to Paris and London, and she made an amazing smash there. She was so close to Albert that he was famous for a party trick he did that were called Bierstadt butterflies. And what he would do is he would put sort of dribble paint on one side of a card or piece of paper, fold it, open it, and there would be a Bierstadt butterfly. Well, it turns out Eliza also did them for him on the side. The sad thing is she never married. Charles, Edward, Eliza, and their sister Helen left New Bedford. And Eliza and Helen went along and chose Niagara Falls and moved to Niagara Falls, which is where Charles became famous by shooting stereo cards of Niagara Falls. And the images that Charles took are really extraordinary. We know Charles Henry Gifford continued visiting and would visit Eliza in Niagara Falls. Let's see, I have an awful lot of notes about Charles Henry Gifford, but this really isn't the point for Charles Henry Gifford. I got to see Charles Henry Gifford's notes and autobiography that were owned by a friend of mine who was doing an exhibit on him at the New Bedford Art Museum. And I got fascinated by Eliza Bierstadt and started researching her. And it's ironic, there are not many books on Bierstadt. There are a few, most of them were published in the 1980s. I think the most recent is called Albert Bierstadt, Art and Enterprise. Gordon Hendrick's book, Albert Bierstadt, Painter of the American West, has a wonderful photograph of Eliza and a few descriptions of her that are in his notes. They didn't make it in the text, they were in the notes. But the great and wealthy Lord de Viren, governor of Canada, was charmed by Eliza and noted that she was an unusually handsome young woman with marked individuality of character and distinction of manner. And she apparently collected autographs from people like the Fremonts, the famous Jessie Fremont and her husband, but she also knew Frederick Church, and she dealt some William H. Beard paintings. I don't think Hendrik really looked hard enough at Eliza Bierstadt. Turns out the Winterthur Museum has a collection of Bierstadt material, and a lot of it is material that came from the letters were written by or to Eliza or his sister or to Bierstadt. And Winterthur describes them as invitations to gatherings, offers to give speeches, etc., etc. But there is a note, there is an Eliza Bierstadt butterfly that is in the collection that describes exactly how she did it. And there are also letters from painters, like Church. It's wonderful material. I wish it was more available, and I want to do some more research. I mean, she was dealing in important paintings, and everyone else is describing her as a charming society girl. She actually lived until 1896 in Niagara, and I contacted the Niagara Falls Public Library, and they sent me Eliza's obituary, which is quite wonderful. It's mostly the information I've talked about here. It mentions that she made her home with Charles and her sister. And the lovely thing is that she was brought back to New Bedford to be buried here. And she is here. So somehow it's appropriate that she's at Rural Cemetery with Albert and her parents. And occasionally on her birthday, on August 31st, I've actually taken her flowers. Luckily, it's very easy to find the Bierstadt burial spot. And can we go forward? This is Rosalie Bierstadt, who was Albert Bierstadt's wife. This is a trick photo of Albert that was taken by Edward, and it was double exposure so that Albert was having tea with Albert. And this is one of the Bierstadt books of photographs. They did a number of these books that apparently sold very well. I haven't been able to find an affordable copy of this one. I do have a copy of a book they did on St. Augustine, Florida, and the photographs are just wonderful. And this is where we're going to stop for the moment. And she is a bit of a mystery that I am working on. Her name is Evie Eastwood. As you can see, she's absolutely drop-dead gorgeous. I found Evie because I was doing some research on Albert Pinkham Ryder, and I tend to read the notes. I mean, notes fascinate me, and you never know what you'll find. Found a reference to the fact that the Archives of American Artists has a typescript of an interview that a woman named Evie Evergood did with an artist who was a good friend of Albert Pinkham Ryder's. Unfortunately, it's not online, so I'm waiting for the microfilm of this interview that Evie did to arrive in New Bedford. What it actually is 176 pages of a book that she was writing about Albert Pinkham Ryder, and she never got to finish it. Well, with the name, I thought, well, I'm never going to find out who this woman is or anything about her. But I went Googling, and ironically, I found Find a Grave with that photograph of Evie. Turns out that Evie was born in New Bedford. She went to the Swain School of Design. She married Edward, her husband, Edward Eastwood, who was also a painter. They went to the Pratt Institute in New York and studied at the Art Students League. This was probably in the mid-1920s. That's where she met this particular artist, Albert Grohl, who had known Ryder and told her all about him. They then went out to art school and studied in California, and eventually came back and lived on the Cape. And Evie lived to be about 80. Her paintings were shown at a number of galleries on the Cape. I haven't seen a painting yet. I have been in touch with her family member who's given me permission to use this photograph of Evie. So she is a mystery that is still unfolding among New Bedford women. And if anyone has any questions, I would love to answer them. Yeah.
You said Caroline Grinnell was adopted by...
Cornelia, yeah.
Was adopted by her grandfather.
By her uncle, Joseph Grinnell.
What happened to her?
There were a number of younger, Cornelia was young enough. There were a number of Grinnell children that, from what I've been able to find, her mother simply couldn't take care of them all, and agreed to have Cornelia be adopted. Cornelius Grinnell Jr. left very little money. I imagine that Joseph helped to support the family. And it's hard to find information about Cornelia's early life. Yeah. Well, we know she sold them out of the Ellis Gallery on William Street, which I am researching and learning a lot about. It was an absolutely extraordinary place. When she moved to Niagara Falls, I am assuming that she would have dealt paintings from her brother Edward's photography studio.
Was she an agent? Was she a clerk?
She was an agent. I have never found any. I think she absolutely loved painting and loved artists. I have not found any evidence of her taking a commission. So, especially for Gifford, who was very poor and really needed help, I think she did it for the love of the artist and the love of the work.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure Eliza's relationship with C.H. Gifford was platonic, right?
Absolutely, as far as I can tell. Charles Henry Gifford had a wife and family, and is one of, he is a great painter. I know the museum has several wonderful Charles Henry Giffords, and as a matter of fact, in the Friends and Famine exhibition, there are two, and on the cover of the catalog is a Charles Henry Gifford that he did on a trip to Europe and Ireland. I have a friend whose husband inherited a collection of Charles Henry Giffords. I will never own a Charles Henry Gifford, but I can admire them. Yes?
Can you tell us what happened to Harriet Jacobs' children?
They grew up safely, and I don't have with me all of the details, but they had a professional life, mostly in Washington, D.C., and they kept in contact with the Grinnell children. There are accounts in this wonderful book of Harriet Jacobs' papers of visits from the Grinnell boys.
Harriet Jacobs' daughter, she had a son and a daughter by the master back in the South. As you could tell, Harriet Jacobs was very light-skinned, and she did pass for white many times. Her daughter also was very light-skinned, and after the Civil War, Harriet and her daughter went down south and had a freedmen's school or a school down there. The son, I don't know, but her brother lived in New Bedford.
Well, thank you all. You've done wonderful.